Hello, everyone. Today's commentary concerns a topic that I dare say is new to most of you. It's called Fifth Generation Warfare, Confronting Communist Corruption of Our Minds. We begin with a quotation from Hannah Arendt, who wrote, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." I recently had the opportunity to interview Dr. Robert Malone for an episode of the Grey Matter podcast. Although Dr. Malone is best known as one of the world's leading mRNA scientific and medical experts, he has recently turned his substantial mental powers to study what he controversially called mass formation psychosis on Joe Rogan's show back in 2021. Dr. Malone's new book, entitled Psyop, is co-authored by his wife Jill, who holds a PhD in anthropology. I have not yet read the book, which is set for an October 2024 release, but during our discussion of it, Dr. Malone introduced me to the concept of fifth-generation warfare and the theater in which it will be waged, our minds. Matthias Desmet is one of the authors referenced in Dr. Malone's new book. Desmet is the Dutch psychologist who got into trouble for pushing against the narrative on COVID. According to Wikipedia, quote, Desmet became known for his negative assessment of the corona measures. He also made a number of statements that were considered untrue and or misleading by fact-checkers. I read Desmet's transformative book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, last year. In it, he argues that the kind of mass formation we saw during COVID, where nearly everyone rushed to get with the latest ukase from on high, is characteristic of modern totalitarianism and its mechanistic worldview. In the epilogue to his book, Desmet cites modern physics, including quantum mechanics and chaos theory, to argue that the mechanistic worldview of the Enlightenment, Newton, and the Industrial Revolution has been superseded and needs to be tossed onto the proverbial trash heap of history. He writes, quote, "The first thing totalitarian leaders do is make sure their voices are the only ones left," end quote. Of course, there is but one problem with this new worldview. Sure, we all live in a yellow submarine that uses the new science, H-bombs and Shannon's law, that information is surprise. But only about 3 people on Earth have any real concept of it whatsoever. I have only one problem with Desmet's ideas. I disagree that mass formation applies just to our modern mechanistic age. I also think that all rulers rely upon propaganda to get us riled up, to get their way, whether it is to go to war in Ukraine, to put on masks, or to get the saboteurs and wreckers. They especially go for mass formation when things go badly, like in the West, where the deep state has grown so corrupt that it no longer hesitates to use the national intelligence agencies and justice departments to initiate political prosecutions or to censor public and private discourse. In France, a court in Paris recently charged 39-year-old Pavel Durov with being complicit in spreading images of child sexual abuse, as well as a litany of other alleged violations on the Telegram messaging app that he founded. In Brazil, where X, the social media giant owned by Elon Musk, has officially been banned. Brazilian elites loathe X for precisely the same reason as elites across the world do. They blame it for the spread of so-called disinformation. In the UK, the BBC falsely reports that far-right thugs burned, looted, and terrorized minority communities as X spreads misinformation about a deadly attack upon schoolgirls by a Rwandan immigrant. The words disinformation and misinformation are neologisms created by government intelligence. They derived the concept from the Soviet secret police, once known as the dreaded KGB. But why now? Well, in the U.S., it is obviously due to Trump. In Canada, it is due to the rise of Pierre Poilievre and the CPC. In the UK, it is Nigel Farage. In France, it is Marine Le Pen. In Brazil, it is Bolsonaro. In Argentina, Milei. The left simply cannot withstand any resistance to propaganda, which is its chosen method of waging fifth-generation warfare. The narrative that Western democratic nations have been lands of free speech is not really true. In the age of the printing press, newspapers, and network TV, our rulers kept free speech on a pretty short leash. For instance, I have come across far-right extremists who mention that certain conservative journalists were silenced during the glorious age of FDR. These include people like John T. Flynn, Harry Elmer Barnes, Charles A. Beard, and Garrett Garrett. The age of social media now means that every self-styled influencer can spew their stuff worldwide. Just like FDR, our current overlords do not like anything that contradicts their narrative. Richard Fernandez wonders if we have finally reached showdown time after the 1989 end of history. Quote, "On the clock of contemporary history, it's showdown time, not simply in America, but the wider West. At stake is the future of a culture. It is about whether history ends with the Western Palace coup or it continues." End quote. Or you can go with George Gilder, who says that information is surprise, wealth is knowledge, economic growth is learning, and that money is time. Or the late Sir Roger Scruton, who said that, quote, "We are in the world in a questioning relation with it. I think everyone is open to the experience of beauty. There's no one thing that matters. You matter. Your life matters, and what you make of it. But also, you can only make anything of your life if you recognize that others matter more." End quote. We must therefore resist the allure of mechanical narratives and the blank slate human mind as signs of totalitarian creep. The most career-destroying toxic heresy in today's mechanistic, hypersensitive world is attributing highly valued traits such as intelligence to our genes and then saying that these and other biologically hardwired traits were unevenly distributed across population groups. This defies elitist narratives about equity and must be treated as misinformation or disinformation. For example, to say that the Chinese disproportionately excel academically due to their genes and not unearned privilege, luck, or any other environmental factor violates this taboo. Those who reject this blank slate ideology will be punished, regardless of supporting evidence or expertise. James Watson is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who co-discovered DNA. He was nonetheless fired from his position and publicly excoriated for speculating that sub-Saharan African economic dysfunction might reflect their lower and genetically determined IQs. Meanwhile, countless scientists, anxious to remain employed, twist themselves into knots to avoid even so much as hinting that natural differences across population groups could explain unequal outcomes in education, in crime, in health, and every other social metric. In principle, this taboo is entirely amenable to scientific inquiry. We are not in the 15th century when contrarian views on impossible-to-prove religious dogma such as free will versus determinism might get one burned alive for heresy. In fact, thousands of scientists do study the role which genes play and publish their findings. Though nearly all such research focuses upon plants and animals rather than humans. So why this dread of documenting the impact of genetics upon human behavior? Ironically, banishing explanations have historically dominated the public square. Victorians frequently explained criminality amongst the poor by their defective genes, while innumeracy among women resulted from their smaller and thus inferior brains. Plausibly, banishing genetic explanations reduces unfair discrimination, so that if women were thought to be genetically inclined to being innumerate, they would be excluded from jobs involving mathematics. Or perhaps, viewing negative traits as biologically hardwired is deemed offensive or might discourage us from even trying to advance economically. Huge risks, therefore, emerge when misapplying the blank slate versus genetic explanations. Between 1928 and 1940, millions of Russian peasants were uprooted from their own land and relocated to collective state-run farms. Soviet leaders, per the Marxism they practiced, which presumes total human malleability, believed that relocated peasants would happily boost Soviet agricultural production thanks to industrialization, sort of akin to the UN 2030 slogan, "You will own nothing and be happy." The result was, of course, disastrous. Grain production plummeted and farmers neglected the collective farm crops. They grew what they needed on tiny private plots while selling that surplus to starving city folk. Livestock production also collapsed. Despite escalating coercion, Russian peasants by their very nature refused to be converted to communists, and millions preferred instead to die in mass famine. On the other hand, women were once thought biologically unsuitable for business due to their emotional temperament and suspect mental toughness. Today, we know this to be clearly false. Women constitute 43% of all those enrolled in MBA programs and are expected to soon reach parity with and even overtake males. The question of aligning visions of human nature and goals is an empirical one to be decided by research. Mother Nature took a dim view of Soviet collectivization, but looked more kindly upon Western women entering MBA programs. Regrettably, ideological fanaticism rather than scientific evidence pushes the blank slated on campus, and the outcome is totalitarian creep. In today's academy, this belief in human mutability takes the form of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DIE. It is axiomatic that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or other human traits, has the same potential to excel academically. Sadly, the reality is otherwise. Despite massive spending and countless remedial programs, schools must still lower their standards to admit blacks, Hispanics, or indigenous students. Nor can this lingering inequality be hidden. Just look at who majors in demanding subjects versus those who scrape by in quote-unquote gut courses. The gap was made crystal clear when black enrollment suddenly fell after a recent Supreme Court of the United States decision banning racial preferences in college admissions. So, what can be done? One option is to confess failure, that Mother Nature gave dissimilar populations different abilities, and to restore the meritocracy. But alas, the blank slate ideology backed by mass propaganda is tenacious. So contemporary college administrators, like the former Soviet commissars, often use deception and coercion to create the appearance that everything is going as planned. As the defunct Soviet Union once fooled millions by claiming to be a workers' paradise, Western universities can be brilliant at creating the illusion of success. A particularly common deception is to admit less qualified minorities, but still assert that they are eminently qualified. Then create special programs such as Black Studies for those struggling academically, or tolerate inflated grades to boost graduation rates. Then add support services like extra tutoring, segregated housing, and huge DIE bureaucracies to rescue overwhelmed students. A more draconian measure is to eliminate dissent by recruiting only faculty who embrace the DIE mantra that diversity is our strength and that all cultures are equal. Further insist that all professors, even those in the hard sciences and engineering, sign DIE pledges and submit statements explaining how their courses promote their school's DIE mission. Meanwhile, party line adherents are rewarded with large salary increases and additional research grants. Particularly onerous, a throwback to deadly religious wars, is to criminalize bad thinking apart from actual behavior. Now, professors who believe that minority students are not academically competitive might be fired for hate. Tellingly, it makes no difference how such hateful professors actually treat minority students. Thinking is in and of itself a crime. As George Orwell put it in his modern classic 1984, quote, "Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death," end quote. The campus orthodoxy is further sustained by refusing to invite apostates to lecture or to disrupt the talks of thinkers like Charles Murray, who do manage to secure invitations. Then add speech codes to silence skeptics who might utter hateful statements. For example, racial preferences are illegal. Student bias response teams will then inform the administration on those privately uttering offensive remarks. If a professor assigns the bell curve, bring them up on charges of creating a hostile learning environment, triggering students of color. If the offending professor refuses to comply, then remove them from the classroom under the guise of helping minority students debilitated by this alleged pseudoscience. Then add Orwellian language to distort reality. Being colorblind is racist, silence is violence, and award academic credit for left-wing political activism. And if that does not suffice, then mandate implicit bias training and compulsory lectures on white privilege, the impact of systemic racism, and how even the most innocuous remarks to protected minorities will academically incapacitate them. For professors who run afoul of the woke mob, publicly harass them in ways reminiscent of Maoist struggle sessions. The correct diagnosis for many of the ills plaguing today's college campus is that school functionaries erroneously embrace the blank slate theory of human nature, where all are intellectually equal. That this is a demonstrable fallacy hardly matters. In principle, this is the same mistake that plagued the Soviets. Then, finally, in the 1980s, reality set in and the edifice of Marxism collapsed. It is thus ironic that genetic determinism, the great boogeyman of modern liberals and often falsely associated with Nazism, may in practice deter tyranny by discouraging doomed-to-fail social engineering. Campus administrators might benefit from a mandatory course called Social Engineering Disasters. The wisdom of the Roman lyrical poet Horace, who lived from 65 BC to 8 AD, is worth noting here. Quote, "You may throw out nature with a pitchfork, but she keeps on coming back." End quote. Communism at universities, just as in greater society, thrives upon resentment, vengeance, and terror. Its chief weapon is disorder, the dismantling of existing structures, the undoing of bonds binding together families, nations, and civilizations. Conservative pundits have been warning of this for decades. Why then has the West moved to the left? Well, according to Jack Posobiec and Joshua Lisich, authors of Unhumans, The Secret History of Communist Revolutions and How to Crush Them, conservatives lose because we do not understand the left or its fifth-generation warfare tactics. These authors say that their book is a software upgrade for saving America and Western civilization. They are unapologetic about the epithet unhumans because communists destroy the human rights of life, liberty, and property and undo their own humanity in the process by fully embracing nihilism, cynicism, and envy. Posobiec is a former naval intelligence officer, TV journalist, and acclaimed conservative pundit. Lisich is a professional ghostwriter. As staunch believers in the, quote, God-given will of the human spirit to build a greater, better world than the one we found ourselves in, end quote, both are committed to fighting back against totalitarian creep. They advocate the principle of exact reciprocity. That which is done by the communists and the regime must be done unto them. Lawfare, naming, shaming, boycotts, cancel culture, the left must be fought using its own fifth-generation weaponry. Their book is no limp-wristed analysis of conservative failures. Rather, it is a clarion call for an iron-fisted counterattack, a counter-revolution, for which they lay out the strategy in the 2 closing chapters. In keeping the promise of helping us understand the left and its tactics, the authors devote the initial chapters to laying out the political history of communist movements in a way that no history book, teacher, or documentary film does. Beginning with the French Revolution, they lay bare the playbook that all far-left uprisings and insurrections have followed, whether in Russia, Spain, China, Cuba, Cambodia, or South Africa. They reveal that communism is not an ideology. It is a war tactic designed to terrorize populations and revoke human rights. Not blood-sated with the 100 million deaths communist revolutions and regimes caused during the 20th century, they seek to destroy what individual effort, initiative, and innovation have achieved. The unhumans, averse to what civilization builds by committing itself to order and social contract, are dedicated to desecration of the beautiful. The authors reach to the very roots of communism, a seemingly commendable obsession with fairness and equality, ideals that the communists have distorted to run counter to equality under the law that free societies uphold. To communists, the obvious unfairness of life and the role of effort, skill, enterprise, innovation, and even chance in determining individual or communal success are the wellsprings to feed resentment and class struggle. Not to build a better world, but to destroy all individual achievement and cultural greatness so that the world is as miserable as they are. The authors also make a strong case against left-favored relativistic multiculturalism that ostensibly seeks to integrate the disparate value systems of religious, ethnic, and cultural groups, but insidiously works to label dominant ones as oppressors. Victimhood, whether real or perceived, is celebrated, while mere accusation is proof of someone or some group being an oppressor subject to punishment. From their extensive study, Posobiec and Lisich conclude that revolutions follow the race of incite, seize, and purge. Incitement builds resentment, envy, and hatred against oppressors through a sustained focus on victimhood of the oppressed. Since violence is the sine qua non of revolution, seizure follows. Property, liberty, and lives are taken with impunity. Finally, purging ensures the removal of the oppressors and any memory of them. The true objective of revolutions is not equality, but power, the emergence of a new leadership with powers far exceeding the original accused oppressors. In the West, the last bastion of capitalism, freedom, and enterprise, this process had to be gradual, and so not all of its steps could be executed. Beginning in the 1960s, the civil rights movement in the U.S. made race a potent means of incitement. As we have seen, a communist-infiltrated academia tore down the icons of Western civilization and repainted them as racists, imperialists, colonists, genocidal murderers, and slave owners. Race hustlers inflamed black rage to make huge fortunes, even as most blacks were kept down, increasing crime, drug abuse, and destruction of family and community life among blacks. In the name of resistance, communists normalized hatred for and violence against majority whites while not sparing successful minorities. Equal access to opportunity was reinterpreted as equality of outcome. People were not treated as individuals with inherent dignity, unique life experiences, and inalienable rights, but instead as members of either oppressor or oppressed camps. This was the teardown of Western society. In the 21st century, communists have adapted the revolutionary playbook to fifth-generation warfare, or 5GW, the achievement of political goals through perception management, narratives, asymmetry, or irregular conflict. The book describes how communists conduct Operation Preparation of the Environment, or OPE, to create conditions for victory. There are 3 stages: separation, messaging, and infiltration. First, choosing grievances to build categories around, assigning blame and guilt to one side and envy and hatred to the other. Second, using the media, especially social media, to reinforce anger in the have-nots and target the haves for their complicity. And third, transformation of the media, societal institutions, government, and even the military through gradual infiltration by communists. It is happening all around us right now. Separation. We have been indoctrinated to see racism where there is none. Messaging. Media brands those opposing males competing in female sports as transphobic. Infiltration. Academia, the media, big corporations, advertising, the courts, key state agencies already are dominated by communists or eager neo-converts fresh out of university. At another level, communists have unleashed anarcho-terrorism, the selective enforcement of laws against a target population. Examples include prosecution of January 6 demonstrators, Freedom Convoy participants, Canadian pastors, and the Coots Boys, while Antifa and BLM rioters were exonerated for the Summer of Love, in which property was destroyed, businesses were looted, and many were assaulted. Another is demonization of police officers in the George Floyd case, despite his clear record as a violent criminal, fentanyl addict, and heart patient. Yet another is the criminalization of self-defense, while courts take a lax view of muggers, robbers, and pedophiles. Committed to taking the fifth-generation fight back to communists, Posobiec and Lesich say that conservatives must even infiltrate the organizations of the Unhumans. Posobiec has never shied away from such wet work himself. He has penetrated Antifa meetings that planned attacks on Trump's 2017 inauguration and the Seattle Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ. He has also written a book about the malevolent conspiracies hatched there called The Antifa, Stories from Inside the Black Box. They also suggest acquiring dominance over social media, creating networks of counter-influencers, for example, so that organizations like Antifa, BLM, and NGOs profiting from mass immigration can be exposed and shamed effectively, while lawfare against them gains broader publicity. Posobiec has even written another book entitled 4D Warfare, A Doctrine for a New Generation of Politics, dedicated to fighting communists on social media. Great men of means, such as free speech proponent Elon Musk and investigative journalist James O'Keefe of Project Veritas, uphold conservative values and fight communists by exposing them. Posobiec and Lesich say that we freedom lovers must support and emulate these warriors. Containment is another strategy that they suggest, doing business only with those who share our values. This may require geographical or economic retreats, but the authors predict that once a critical mass of boycotters is reached, the Unhumans will turn on themselves as predators invariably do. The Bud Light Dylan Mulvaney controversy certainly proved this hypothesis. The Unhumans will not stop until they are stopped. Now we know how to stop them. It is up to each of us to join in the battle for our minds and for our very lives. We end with a quotation from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Quote, "The only proper purpose of a government is to protect man's rights, which means to protect him from physical violence. The only proper functions of a government are the police to protect you from criminals, the army to protect you from foreign invaders, and the courts to protect your property and contracts from breach or fraud by others, to settle disputes by rational rules according to objective law." End quote.